Has Australia's luck finally run out? Jim Rickards, in a recent strategic intelligence update, you said that Australia is in double trouble. What did you mean?
Well, Nick, first of all, there's no disputing the fact, of course, I've been to Australia many times, a lot of friends down there, I love going there. And I know for as long as I remember, going back 40 years, it's been called the lucky country. That probably goes back even further. They had a technical recession last year, along with the rest of the world, but it was very short-lived and came after, I think, 26 or 27 years without a recession, including several, through the global financial crisis. So Australia deserves the name, and it's got a lot of natural resources, beautiful country, very highly educated people. So it has everything going for it and great trading relationships. So it's hard to kind of come up with a negative story on Australia. There is a problem. And when I said the double trouble, I was referring to the possibility at the time of a new outbreak of the pandemic and a slowing down of basically the economy in China, with which Australia is very closely joined. Both of those things have now come to pass. And again, just to be clear, I'm very familiar with the Australian real estate market and the Australian labor market. Unemployment's low, a lot of jobs being created, real estate's booming. So I don't want to suggest that Australia is about to fall into the Indian Ocean. But the truth is, the new outbreak is severe. It's popping up all over the world. This is not unique to Australia. It's the so-called Delta variant. I don't want to turn this into a virology class, but it's a cousin, if you will, or a close relative of the original virus. I use the word relative metaphorically. Scientists don't even agree if a virus is a living thing or not, but they're around. Part of the genetic sequence, the genome code is different. The differences appear to make it more contagious. Just to be clear, not necessarily more fatal. That's what we're seeing in the United States. The caseload is going up very steeply in the United States. That's clear, indisputable. But the fatality rate is not, which is good news. That means that's because treatments are better and facilities are better, and people are more, clinicians are more seasoned in terms of dealing with the virus. Australia's now got a lockdown, extreme lockdown in Sydney. I read Australian news along with news from all over the world. I think if you get in your car and try to leave town, you're put under arrest and actually put in jail. So that's a pretty serious lockdown. I think a curfew or stay-at-home type situation. I'm not exactly sure what the situation is in Victoria. I know they've been through some severe lockdowns. So that's coming back. It affects tourism. It affects supply chain. It affects consumption. So that's a little bit of a drag on Australian growth right there. The bigger drag, and why I use the phrase double trouble, is China. China's slowing down dramatically. They've got some outbreaks of the pandemic. They're pretty ruthless about suppressing that. I don't mean suppressing the news; they do that too. But containing it. So I don't want to put too much weight on that. China's just in trouble economically. Too much debt. They rely too much on, it's an input-output factory. So the inputs are, raw materials, coal, iron ore, food, soybeans, et cetera, and energy, certainly oil, natural gas, which they get from various sources, but probably Australia, Brazil, and Qatar for natural gas, and Saudi Arabia for oil. Iran also are the major countries from which China buys its goods. And then they do kind of Lego style assembly manufacturing, and they ship to the rest of the world, textiles and electronics and other goods. Well, the rest of the world's slowing down. The US is slowing down. I think we're going to get our GDP numbers. We'll see in a day or two for the second quarter. We'll see what they are. But the best estimates over the course of the quarter, the best estimates have dropped from 13% annualized to about 7% annualized. Now, as we sit here, I don't know the number right now, but it looks like it's going to come in around that 7 or 8% level. We'll see. But that's down from earlier estimates to 13%. So, good growth by some measures, but considering we're coming off the worst recession since 1946, you could expect those to be higher. But the important thing is that over the course of the quarter, the numbers dropped, and the way the particular metric I'm thinking of, the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta GDP now, so-called nowcast, calculates it, that would actually indicate that growth slowed throughout the quarter, so that June was significantly slower than April. And a lot of other indicators, lining up along those lines. Initial claims for unemployment have come down, but they're plateaued, and they went up a little bit recently and so forth. So U.S. is slowing. Europe is definitely slowing. Well, Europe and U.S. are the markets that buy stuff from China. So if we're slowing, they're slowing. So China's got a bad mix of a strong currency at the moment, which does not help their exports. Slowing in Europe and the U.S., which are major outlets for the stuff they buy. And then, as I said, I mentioned a debt problem. And then there's a demographic disaster. That's maybe a subject for another day. That's a bigger subject. But all that means is they're going to be buying less stuff from Australia. So combine the pandemic lockdown with the Chinese slowdown, and Australia is very dependent on China. When that relationship works, Australia wins. But when it doesn't work, Australia suffers the most. So that's a combination that will, at a minimum, slow the Australian economy, probably not into another recession, but considering how much they were booming, even a significant slowdown is important.
Let's remind readers as well of the geopolitical angle on the Chinese economy, the idea that all these different nations are going to try and be less reliant on China as it throws its weight around, because that should have an impact on Chinese growth as well.
Well, there's no doubt about it. So you've got sort of pure geopolitics, which leaving economics is part of geopolitics, of course, but you have the emergence of what's called the Quad, which sort of emerged during the Trump administration, but is carried on into the Biden administration. It's not a formal alliance in the sense of NATO, but it kind of acts like one. And it's the four countries in the Quad are Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. And all you have to do is look at a map, and you can see that China doesn't have a well-developed transportation system trans-Asia. They're working on it, but it's not there. Everything has to come in or out by sea, and there are a group of barrier islands, and then much larger countries, Australia and India. Well, Australia and Japan, all of them. Japan's obviously an archipelago that surround China. And then you throw in a couple other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, the strategic choke points, Straits of Malacca, Taiwan Straits, and a few other the Straits of Japan. It's pretty easy to choke off China with superior naval power. It wouldn't be difficult to do at all. I'm not saying that's desirable. I'm just saying you could do it. And China's very well aware of that. So if you get US, Japan, Australia, and India in a de facto alliance with control of those choke points, all the sea lanes, major navies on all sides, China is completely vulnerable. So that's one counterweight to Chinese efforts to expand into a Western Pacific or, if you will, East Asian kind of hegemonic position. They're going to be choked off from doing that. But beyond that, India looks like the better bet. Again, economically, if I had to choose between China and India, that's an easy decision. You go with India; their future looks a lot brighter. Even recently, China went so far as to say they would use nuclear weapons against Japan if Japan aided a U.S. effort to blunt an invasion of Taiwan. So notice if China invades Taiwan, very clear the U.S. will jump in on the Taiwanese side. The Japanese said they'll do so also, and in which case China said, well, we'll use nuclear weapons on Japan. So it's rhetoric at this stage, but it could get real. The threat's real, but the action could get real. China, now I'm talking 30, 40 years out. So again, I don't want to, this is not your trading idea du jour, but the demographic angle in China is they're toast. I mean, basically, you can stick a fork in it. China's population might drop, it's not a question of leveling off or dropping 10%. China's population might drop by almost half in the next 30 or 40 years, to the point of instability and undermining the legitimacy of the Communist Party. Now, it's starting now. I mean, those trends are starting now. They're beginning to have an economic impact. They're going to play out over decades. But I always say, if I know something, the Chinese do too. They spend all their time thinking about it. Well, if that's your forecast, and it is the forecast, it's a good one. It's almost demographics are like a glacier. They may move slowly, but they're kind of irreversible, hard to stop. If they see that, will the Chinese do something extreme to enhance their power in the face of a demographic tsunami that's going to diminish their power? They just might. Again, Taiwan is the trouble spot there. So there's, and Canada has been, of course, a good ally of the United States, and Canada's in the crosshairs of the fact that I believe the CFO, I think she's the CFO and the daughter of the founder of Huawei is under house arrest in Canada for espionage at the request of the United States and facing extradition and trial in the United States. So put Canada in the mix, but it's a pretty powerful alliance. But China's doing nothing to be friendly. Nobody wants a war with China. Nobody wants even the kind of new Cold War that we're in. It's not coming, it's already here. But China is embraced what they call wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf Warrior was I think until recently, the most successful movie, most popular movie in China. It's about a Chinese group of commandos who train kind of like the US Navy SEALs and go on all these Mission Impossible type things. But wolf warrior diplomacy, and that's where the name comes from, is basically aggressive. You don't assuage the United States. You insult the United States. You throw down challenges. You say the world won't get along until the U.S. corrects its errors, stops its arrogance, stops interfering with internal affairs of China, and that would again have reference to Hong Kong, et cetera. So Australia has felt this. Australia was the one. I give them credit, enormous credit, for being the first country to say that we ought to have an independent investigation of the source of the pandemic, the source of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which caused the COVID-19 disease. A lot of people think that. I think it. I wrote it in my book, The New Great Depression. But Australia, as a government, an official position, came out and said that. Well, that was the beginning of a trade embargo imposed by China on Australia. It didn't get that far because they still need the coal. But probably gave a little ding to Australian wine, which is very good wine, by the way. So yeah, it's China's confrontational. They're belligerent at a time when maybe it would behoove them to be a little more friendly. They're vulnerable in some ways that are short-term geopolitical and long-term demographic. They're a declining society.
I'm in Japan, so if the nukes do fly, they'll be going right over my head on their way to Tokyo. And also, my wife's actually pregnant, so I'm trying to do my best about the demographics in Japan at least, but I don't think it's going to make enough of a difference. I think most Australians are used to the idea, because we have this narrative that China saved us from the 2008 crisis. They're used to the idea of China being a really important part. But what we're not so used to is the idea that lockdowns don't really work in your view. They're sort of futile in the sense that they do economic damage without really preventing this almost rhythm of each wave of COVID. So can you explain that, unfortunately, to people in Sydney?
Sure. And I have a lot of friends in Sydney. I certainly sympathize with what's going on there. Well, you said lockdowns don't work, in my opinion. That's true, but it's not just my opinion. There's a lot of science behind that, and I quote this. I cite this in my book. I guess it's not like a book salesman, but I'm pretty shameless when it comes to promoting it. But the book has 200 footnotes, and or endnotes are at the end. And if you look at them, they're, for the most part, primary sources. They're peer-reviewed scientific papers. I did an enormous amount of research when I wrote it. One of the things I uncovered, there's an individual named D.A. Henderson, Dr. D.A. Henderson. Not necessarily a household name, but he was the single man most responsible for the eradication of smallpox in 1979. Now, that was a global effort. A lot of people deserve credit, but he was the leader of that. And they isolated and basically ended the last smallpox outbreak that was detected. So right now, there are no smallpox cases on the face of the earth. The virus itself does exist in a few laboratories. There's one in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, one in Russia, I dare say one in China. So it's around in some highly secure containers, but it's not, no human has it as of now. He eradicated smallpox. He was the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, which is probably our most prestigious school of public health, and recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor the U.S. can bestow It's the civilian equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor. So I could go on, but Eradication of Smallpox, dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So he's not some fringe character. He wrote a paper in 2006, and at the time we were sort of getting through the there was an avian flu at the time, I believe it was swine flu, around the same time. He said lockdowns don't work, and he explained why. Now, yeah, you can do it, and if you have an island, a small island, and there are no aircraft and ships are the only way in or out, and you say no ships, yeah, that works. That's an extreme case and a rare case. But in a larger society, Australia, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, China, any of them, you tell people they can't travel from A to B. Well, they'll go in the neighborhood, they'll stay home, they'll spread the disease to somebody else. Maybe the identity of the victim or the one who gets the contagion changes, but the total number doesn't change. You're just spreading it in different ways. There's nothing worse than being inside. Nothing worse than being inside. Homes become little incubators, and an aunt or an uncle or a cousin or a child's friend or somebody comes by, and they get it. What's the difference between that and jogging across the country? Maybe some individual does spread the virus. The virus kind of goes where it wants. That's the point. So lockdowns can change the identity set of people who receive the contagion to some extent, but they don't change the extent of it. They don't contain the virus. People find ways around it, human nature being what it is, and the virus kind of goes where it wants. I mean, just look at the outbreak in the White House, and the President of the United States and his wife got it, and a large number of the White House staff. It's hard to think of a more locked down place than the White House. I've been there on official business a number of times. It's not, you can't just walk right in. So lockdowns don't work, but politicians need to appear to be doing something. So, by the way, the other thing that doesn't work, we talked about, are masks. Everyone's walking around with masks. It's ridiculous. A mask is a weave. You can put a mask under a microscope and see the weave, the kind of vertical or vertical and horizontal fibers. The virus, which can only be seen under an electron microscope, is 1/5000th the size of the weave, meaning the virus goes right through the mask. I read one analogy that I thought was a good one. It says it's like shooting marbles at a building with a scaffold. Every now and then a marble will hit the scaffold, but 99% of them are going to hit the building. In other words, that you're going to get hit with the virus. People don't wear them correctly. I was once, I wore a mask as little as possible during our stages of the pandemic here in the US. But occasionally you had to, a store would require it. And I'm not going to fight with the greeter at Walmart, put the mask on. But I was in the store and I had to sneeze. I didn't have COVID, by the way, but I just had to sneeze. And I took my mask off to sneeze, and I put it back on again because I didn't want to sneeze in the mask. It's sort of, gross. But the point is, they don't work. So lockdowns don't work. Masks don't work. Social distancing doesn't work. That came out of a 19th century paper by some German scientist. Good scientist, but he was the guy who came up with the 6 foot thing, maybe 2 meters, I guess, in his jargon. And he said, "This is a guess." I mean, he was very candid. He said, "This is a guess." But somehow the whole world's got to stand 6 feet apart. So these things are really jokes. The thing that does work, washing your hands works. Washing your hands is a good thing. If you're sick, stay home. Don't go out and spread it around. There are, clinicians know the most about it. They were killing people with respirators. Remember, well, at least in the U.S., politicians were screaming, with the ventilators. Sorry, I guess they were ventilators. Ventilators, get us these ventilators. Well, a ventilator is like a life support machine. It pumps your lungs when you can't do it. That was never the problem. The lungs work. The problem was the oxygen could not get from the lungs to the blood. That's a different problem than saying your lungs don't work. The ventilators were killing people. What does work is oxygen. Not a ventilator, just pure oxygen. That's what they gave Boris Johnson, and he nearly died. And that decision, ventilator, oxygen, the doctor said, give him oxygen. He survived. He suffered pretty badly. It was near death. But so these are examples. That's the kind of thing the clinicians pick up on that the eggheads and universities and the think tanks do not. So we're living under this kind of reign of terror of politicians who need to be seen to be doing something, ordering masks and lockdowns that demonstrably don't work, and the science shows that. They're not good at stopping the virus. It is good at destroying an economy. They're very good at that. So that's what we're doing.
It seems to me that we're learning a similar lesson when it comes to vaccines at the moment, where we've got large outbreaks of cases in areas with high vaccination rates. What's going on there? Are we discovering that vaccines don't work as we've been told, in the sense that they're not going to free us up from lockdowns?
Well, it's a great question, Nick. It seems to be my night to step into controversial areas, but yeah, I mean, you've got it right. The vaccines do not work as advertised. Now, that's clear. Whether they're partly effective, not as effective as we thought, or short-term effective but wear off quickly, these are all areas that deserve further investigations. But the early evidence is sort of that they work somewhat in the initial stages and they wear off fairly quickly. Let me define work. When I say they work, let's talk about what these things are. They're not vaccines. A traditional vaccine, and by the way, this is a legal definition for U.S. patent law purposes, but a traditional vaccine, they inject you with some, or scratch and rub or whatever, some part of either the disease you're trying to prevent or something very close. And the classic case was if I give you a smallpox infection, that'll produce antibodies that will keep you from getting if I give you a cowpox, I misspoke. If I give you a cowpox injection, that will produce antibodies that prevent smallpox. That's how they noticed it. They said that the milkmaids were not getting smallpox. Why is that? Well, because they all had cowpox, which is fairly mild, and it does prevent smallpox, and so on through a long list of diseases. That's not what these so-called vaccines are. These are experimental gene modification treatments. They're not FDA approved. That's our U.S. Food and Drug Administration. I'm not sure what the status is around the rest of the world, but they're not FDA approved. They're being used under an emergency authorization. But they do something very different. It's called mRNA, modified ribonucleic acid. It's a little strip of genetic code that gets into your cells, kind of takes over your cells and hijacks part of the cell structure and replicates itself into a spike protein, which is what the disease is, what the SARS-CoV-2 virus is. And then your body does attack that. And then those antibodies and other cellular responses, molecular responses, are then there to prevent you from getting sick, getting ill if you actually get the virus. Now, just to be clear, you can still be infected. If you're vaccinated, you can still be infected. All that happens is your body is a little more prepared for the infection and you don't get as sick. Okay, well, that's a good thing. That does cut down on extreme cases and fatalities. It does not cut down on infections. And that's the point. You're actually giving yourself the disease to create a response that will then hang around in case you actually get the disease. But you can get the disease and you can spread it even with the vaccines. No sooner were people getting their second jabs than now the news is, well, you might need a booster. A booster is kind of a euphemism. I call it a third jab. Well, what about the fourth, the fifth, the sixth? I mean, when is that going to end? And now we've seen some horrific reports of side effects. Now, again, there are side effects to every vaccine, every medical treatment has side effects, and you weigh the costs and benefits. But we're not getting straight answers on the severity of the side effects, the frequency of the side effects. You can't really have informed consent. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm not saying these vaccines shouldn't be out there. I am saying that people who get them should have a choice, and they should, if they agree, it should be informed consent. That's not what's happening. Again, at least in the United States, and I dare say around the rest of the world, we're seeing mandates, and we saw a bunch of them just in the last 2 or 3 days. So supposedly President Biden is considering ordering all federal workers, and we're talking millions of individuals, that they must get the vaccine, or they have to be tested, once a week. And these are very intrusive, disruptive type tests. They're really just kind of designed to harass you into getting the vaccine. Governor Cuomo of New York has ordered mandatory vaccines for all state workers, again, unless you want to be tested, as I said, once a week. All healthcare workers must get it. I believe Facebook, they want to be careful. I think it was Facebook or one of the big tech companies said all their employees have to get it. And so we're seeing this company by company. So do we have a federal 100% vaccine mandate? No. but going company by company, state by state, institution by institution. Universities are saying you can't come back to school unless you're vaccinated, et cetera. So we're getting to the same place. And this is mandatory unless you want to quit your job, drop out of school, don't travel, et cetera. Europe's worse. They do have they are coming up with a kind of a vaccine passport, be a QR code on your cell phone. You can show it when you go through customs or whatever. Your medical history is on open display. It used to be medical history was one of the most closely protective things under laws in most countries. Now, you get the vaccine, you go into a database so other people can look you up so they can figure out if you're vaccinated or not. What happened to privacy? So this has a lot of neo-fascist elements in it. It's becoming de facto mandatory. Your public health information is being spread all over the place. There's a kind of severe segregation against those who have not had the vaccine. You're being treated like lepers, being put in separate sections of a public venue, no hot dogs or beer for you, sort of thing. And this is going on. This is not, my dystopian forecast. It's actually going on. I see it in the news every day.
The angle on this that is relevant to financial markets and investing is that the vaccines are not looking like the key to unlocking economies from these lockdowns. We've seen that in a few countries. The one I'm thinking of right now is Iceland, where one of the chief epidemiologists has said we might be stuck with lockdowns for, I think he said 10, 15, or even 20 years, because the vaccines, which are at a very high rate of vaccination in Iceland, are not stopping these infections, these cases, as they're called, without much of a definition for what a case is. So right. For Australia, the story has been that we don't have enough vaccines. So the vaccination rate's too slow. But our point, or at least my point, would be that that doesn't necessarily mean that once the vaccination rates are higher, we're going to be able to, return to the new normal. Do you think there's going to be a divide between the different types of countries where they've made a pitch towards zero COVID and it's not going to work, versus the countries that have had the virus, whatever that means, like the UK, where the cases now are falling despite the fact that Freedom Day is about a week and a half in the past?
Yes, I think there'll be divisions between countries that are pursuing different policies. I think you mentioned a few of the extreme cases. Iceland, I put New Zealand in the same category. Maybe Australia, based on what we're seeing, versus other countries such as the UK that have had a tough time of it, but have seemed to take a live and let live attitude. So there'll be divisions among the countries, and then within the countries, there'll be divisions between the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. Now, there's a very large group that no one talks about that I think is critically important. There is a group, a large group in the United States. It's 33 million people, or 10% of the population, who had COVID and recovered. Well, they have better antibodies than people with the vaccines. They have the natural antibodies that one would expect. And those seem to be much more long lasting than the vaccine produced responses, molecular responses. So, but what about them? They're technically unvaccinated. That's true, but they have better antibodies than those who have the vaccination. So even if you want to distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated, and I think there's a lot of problems with that, in the unvaccinated group, what about the 33 million recovered individuals who had COVID and have the antibodies? Shouldn't they at least be put in a different category? You're not hearing that at all in the United States. It's not discussed. It's as if they don't exist. It's as if there's a crusade for 100% vaccination, and children shouldn't get children should not get the vaccine. The side effects it's not even close. The side effects in children are far worse than the disease, which they rarely get, don't spread. And this has all happened in about a year and a half. Usually some of these drug trials normally go on for 2, 3, 5 years or longer. We don't know what the side effects of these are going to be, although some of them are starting to appear. And now that the vaccines have been around for 6 months or even longer, again, we referred earlier to the fact they call the new infections of the vaccinated. So the vaccinated are getting sick, and they call it a breakthrough infection. Well, just call it an infection. Spare me your euphemisms. You got the vaccine, you got infected, and you're sick. That's happening. Don't blame the unvaccinated. So yes, I think there'll be division among countries. By the way, in the COVID pandemic is the third worst pandemic in the last 650 years measured by fatalities. Number one was the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919. Number two was the Black Death of the 1350s, mid 14th century. And number three is COVID. COVID is, we're up to about 4 million deaths worldwide. The next closest pandemic, the number of fatalities was about 200,000. That was the Asian flu in 1958. So yeah, it's serious. I mean, a lot of deaths, a lot of cases. But we have to remember, everyone's shouting, the cases are up, the cases are up. They are. The fatalities are not up. Fatalities have kind of plateaued for the reasons we mentioned, better treatment and better clinical experience, et cetera. So let's not equate a case of COVID with a death. And politicians are doing that. They're saying, if you don't get this vaccine, you're going to die. Well, actually, you're not going to die. You might get COVID, and people with the vaccine might get COVID. We're now learning that. But if you do, you have, depending on your age group and comorbidities and other factors, you have a 99.8 or 0.2, or again, depending on your age, chance of survival. And in younger people without, asthma or diabetes or obesity, or other, when I say younger, even people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, have a very, very low mortality rate from this. So, every death is one too many, and there's enough tragedy to go around. But just because the caseload is going up, it doesn't mean the fatalities are going up. They're not. But one thing that is going up is immunity. If you have it and you don't die, and that's 99+% of the people, you're in pretty good shape. And so that's when that factor gets big enough, it's called herd immunity. It does seem that the UK is sort of moving towards something like herd immunity. Again, I'm not anti-vax. If you want to get the vaccination, be my guest. I would just sound all these cautionary notes about what it really is, how it really works, and whether it lasts. But if you want it, that's fine. It's readily available. But the greatest source of resistance to the disease will be survivors. There's the main model used in epidemiology to forecast and track the course of a pandemic is called the SEIR model. It's susceptible, exposed, infected, and recovered. So let's not forget about the R. And some people do die. I mean, I'm not making light of that, but basically getting it and surviving it, which is the most likely result, is how a society gets past a pandemic.
To me, the interesting side of this is that there's this trade-off between the vaccine versus getting COVID, the side effects and all this sort of thing. The reason people with extremely low chances of having trouble with COVID get the vaccine is to protect others. But if you're still going to get cases in the vaccinated and they're still going to pass on the virus, then why are these people where the risk of COVID is extremely low getting vaccinated? That benefit to society, to the people who are vulnerable, is no longer there. But let's move on to a particular issue that all Australians love to talk about. You call it double trouble when it comes to China and the virus and lockdowns. What about bubble trouble, housing bubble trouble? Do you think Australian house prices are finally going to take a hit at some point during this pandemic?
Well, we're seeing a boom in housing prices in Australia, no doubt about it. We're seeing the same thing in the United States and Canada and some other countries. So it's a bit of a global phenomenon. I think this is one that's different than past bubbles, and I would just kind of reserve judgment on the bubble aspect of it in the following sense. The old cliche in real estate is, location, location, location. You got to get the right location. And that's true. That's always been true. But what we're seeing is a kind of exodus from urban centers moving out into either suburban areas or what are sometimes called ex-urban areas. That's the next ring past the suburbs, or even out into the country. I'm up here in New England in the United States. We've seen people in New York buying, very attractive homes in places like New Hampshire and Vermont, sight unseen. I mean, they'll go to the website and take the virtual tour, call a broker, put in a bid, and then kind of get up and drive up and look at the house they just bought. But that's going on. You can't get any home improvement done. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, masons, painters, they're booked a year in advance. They won't even take your bookings out. Like, call me next year and we'll see what we can do. But I can't take any new clients. supply shortages. So that's how bad it is. And again, we're seeing the same thing in Australia. But if that's driven by people leaving cities and going to suburbs, and okay, the house prices go up and all that, is that really good for the economy? Cities are the greatest wealth generators in the history of civilization. That's where civilization comes from cities. You get dense concentrations of talent, finance, artistic talent, performing arts, writers, bankers, lawyers, accountants, and just everyday jobs and to support that entire network. Well, if you start ripping that out, and it starts with maybe the more elite occupations, the lawyer, accountant, banker, whatever, they can work from home. Okay, all of a sudden home is, in our case in Miami, Florida, maybe where you are, it's on the Gold Coast or Perth or someplace, but home is not where it used to be. But what about the support network, the transportation, the cleaning staff in the building, the food trucks, the restaurants, the bars? That all drops by 50% or more if people aren't going to the offices. So you begin to have a major economic drag. Now, does that bid up the price of housing in some of these more distant locations? No doubt about it. And some of that's real because there's a real preference for, as I say, getting out of the cities. So yeah, you've got a boom. With a boom, there's always a risk of a bubble. I would watch it carefully, but I would say at least part of it, maybe even a lot of it, is real in the sense it's being driven by real demand to get out of cities. And then the other factor in Australia is a lot of your real estate that was in cities prior to COVID was driven by Chinese demand. The joke last time I was in Melbourne was, the national bird was the crane because there were so many cranes on the horizon putting up new high rises. But that is cooling off a lot because of capital controls in China and the whole standoff, diplomatic and trade standoff between China and Australia. So putting all that together, is there a housing boom? Yes, but it's selective in the sense that there's certain kind of go-to destinations that are booming, but I'm not sure that's as true in the city centers. And that exodus from the cities can be a bit of an economic drag in terms of consumption and other output factors.
What about investing in commodities? Because on the one side, we've got this China story. On the other side, we've got the fact that commodities are very undervalued, at least relative to other financial assets. And you've got inflation potentially on the horizon, or at least at the moment. So it would seem to me that there's this weird situation for Australia where our key industry looks set to have a good future, but then the big buyer for commodities in China is going to struggle. So which of the two factors do you think is going to outweigh the other?
Well, I'm one of the doubters on the inflation narrative, and I know it's a powerful narrative. It's the number one question I get in interviews. It's, turn on any financial channel or read any headline, you'll find the inflation versus deflation debate, which is a little, I don't forecast deflation. I forecast disinflation. Knows a much lower rate of inflation, more in the order of 1.5% rather than the 3, 4, 5% that we've been seeing lately. So I don't buy into the inflation narrative. I think it's been hyped. The recovery is not that strong. We talked about Australia being kind of tethered to China and slowing down for that reason. Europe's already slowing down. The US, I think, is going to surprise to the downside in the next 6 months. A lot of the big inflation numbers that we saw in April, May, and June were because of base effects, at least the way we report them in the US. We take a month and it's year over year. So yeah, the April number was hot, but it was compared to April 2020 on an annualized basis. And what was going on in April 2020? Well, the worst recession since 1946 and plunging prices. So you have to extract that low base. You would expect it to be a significantly higher off a falling price index the year before. But somehow you have to separate that so-called base effect from kind of the real, ongoing inflation, if there is any. And that's hard to do because the base effects are rarely that big. You do get business cycles and ups and downs, but nothing like what we saw in 2020. So, but that's going to go away. When you get to August, September, October, what was happening in August, September, October 2020? Well, it was a boom. I mean, it was huge. We had just as we had the biggest drop in the first and second quarter, first half of 2020. We had the biggest boom recovery to that stage in the third quarter of 2020. Well, and that meant prices go up. And so when you get to the third quarter of 2021, the base effect is going to be gone. You've set the bar very high. And I think those inflation numbers are going to fall off a cliff. This inflation narrative is going to get the rug pulled out from under it. And if you say, well, how do I know that? Well, I mean, the base effect, we all know that's publicly available, but don't look to the stock market and don't look to the housing market. They usually drive off a cliff in terms of bubbles. The markets that get it right are bonds and gold. And for bonds, look at the yield to maturity on US 10-year treasury notes. Those have dropped like a stone. March 31st, it was 1.745%. About a week ago, Monday, when the stock market fell out of bed, it traded briefly at 1.18%. Right now, I think it's around 1.22%. But that's still a half a percentage point lower than it was just about 4 months ago. And that's an earthquake in bond land. It's a half a percentage point, big deal. No, that is a very big deal, particularly when you're working off such a low level to begin with. To go from round numbers, kind of 1.45, 1.5 down to 1.2, that's big. And by the way, huge capital gains for the holders of those notes because prices move inversely, rates down, prices up. A little counterintuitive. That's how the bond market works. So the bond market is telling you that they're not worried about inflation. If they were, the rates would be 2% or maybe on their way to 2.5%. They're not. They're coming down. So the bond market has a much better track record of predicting the future, reading the economy. The bond market does not buy the inflation narrative. If they did, the rates would be going up. Instead, they're going down. And gold is another one. Gold's okay. Gold's kind of gone sideways, trading in a narrow range. We did have that 4.5% drop a couple of weeks ago, but it's come back from that, and not all the way, but a lot of the way. But gold's been trading in a broad range between US dollar 1,700 and 1,900. Central tendency is $1,800 an ounce. Today it was like 1,801. I mean, it was right in the middle of that broad range. It's 5.5% above and below. It's a wide range, but gold's been in that range for 10 months. So, but that tells you that inflation is not right around the corner. Now, will it come eventually? Of course. But 2 years, 3 years down the road, that's a function of the demographic wave that we talked about earlier. But for the next year or so, I would expect the disinflation narrative to take hold. Now, lower interest rates can be good for gold also. Inflation is definitely good for gold, but lower rates are good because gold doesn't have any interest. So if you think of gold competing with bonds for investor allocations, the lower the interest rate is, the more attractive gold looks because your opportunity cost is lower. So I think it's a very good setup for gold. But if inflation were right around the corner, gold would be a lot higher.
Jim Rickards, thanks very much for joining us and explaining the details of Australia's double trouble.
Thanks, Nick.